All right, so this is New Imperialism. So this is 1870 to 1914. This is a map of the world, and these are like these colors represent colonies. So Britain is all of this stuff. This I don't know what color it is. It's like a salmon color. Okay. France is this bluish color. All right. So the civilized world, as it was called, and it's in quotations for a reason because this would not be cool today. It's not politically correct to say, but so Europeans, and this would include Americans, they saw other nations as being backwards, and they felt that they were superior in terms of like their material standards, meaning the food that they ate, the housing, the sanitation, the transport, communications, and also their values. So they valued science over superstition. They had secular Christian morality over heathenism, as they called it. There was the banning of polygamy, infanticide, which is the killing of babies, prohibition on torture. There's no more caste systems, and slavery by this point has been outlawed. And the evidence that they used to back up their belief that they were civilized is the falling death rate, the declining infant mortality, the rising life expectancy in each of these countries, the improved level of literacy. They had higher labor productivity. Then science and letters often uphold these views, meaning if you look at the theory of evolution, right, that was then perversely changed into social Darwinism. Is so like there's a scientific proof that the West was in some way superior to all the other places. Completely not true. But then you have this romantic exoticism, meaning they viewed like Asia or Africa as somehow foreign and exotic, not like what the West was. It was different. It wasn't civilized. And so this allowed for the exploitative trade relations that were imposed on these people by the West. So imperialism, it's the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the political, economic, and the social life of the people of that nation. And part of this is about national pride. It's also about racism and social Darwinism. It's also about economic competition and then missionary zeal. And by missionary zeal, I'm talking about you want to bring Christianity to them. This is very similar to the things that we talked about with Spain and Portugal way back in 1492. It hasn't gone away. It's a different form now. So this is the new imperialism. So social Darwinism, it was first, it has nothing to do with Darwin. It actually has to do with this guy by the name of Herbert Spencer, who 1820 to 1903. And he says here, society advances where its fittest members are allowed to assert their fitness with the least hindrance. And then we have George Bernard Shaw. He says, the only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man. In other terms of human evolution, we must eliminate the Yahoo or his vote will wreck the Commonwealth. So he's afraid that if you give the vote to people, this is going to destroy the civilized world. The other thing here is this is where the selective breeding, this would be where it's taboo. It's just forbidden for people of one race to marry and have children with another race, which is completely unbelievable because when you go to college, you'll learn about it, depending on what classes you take. These men who left Europe to go to Africa and Asia, they didn't bring women with them, European women. And of course they were having sex. And of course they were having children. And this creates all kinds of problems. And then women will come, European women will come later. And then this creates a whole other set of problems too. But this idea it's just completely flawed. And then we have Cecil Rhodes. He says, we, the Anglo-Saxons, this is the British, are the first race in the world. And the more of the world we inherit, the better it is for humanity. Not a little prideful there, is he? So some reasons for imperialism's success are the West had communications and telegraphs, or transportation. So we have telegraphs, they had steamships, they have railroads, they have advanced technology, specifically the Maxim gun, which is a repeating rifle. It's not a machine gun, it's a device you have to sit behind and you crank, but it makes a huge difference when you're trying to take over a country that has bow and arrow, or they have rifles, but they're like one shot. And then this is super important. It's the introduction of quinine. Quinine is used in like seltzer water or tonic water, I mean. So if you mix that, it's kind of like bitter tasting, but if you mix it with like alcohol, so like the British, their famous drink is gin and tonic. So it's gin, which is an alcoholic beverage, and then tonic. And the tonic has quinine in it. And so if you drink that, it will help alleviate the problems of malaria. There we go. Sorry. All right, then we have disparaging cultures and languages. There are treaties that were actually signed between the governments that existed in these countries, like in Africa or in Asia. However, the treaties, when they were written in the language of the people, and then when they were translated into, say, English or French or German or whatever, they were vastly different. So these were surreptitious. This was not a fair way to go about doing things. Um, the other countries that were going to be imperialized, they had relatively low levels of technology. And these leaders of these countries were really at the mercy of the colonizers if they wanted to get better access to weapons. And then we have various types of strife among local leaders, meaning you've got maybe 3, 4, maybe if it's even 2 people fighting inside of this country, right? So like in India. The British move in and they have superior weapons, and they'll side with one side that gives them the better treaty, and then they'll come to their aid, and this is a way of them taking over. So this is the Maxim gun. This is actually Hiram Maxim right here firing this gun. This is quinine. It's an anti-malarial drug. They have engineering, so ability to build bridges, and you can use those bridges to move railroads, large numbers of people and material. Then you have steamships, which allow you to travel upstream instead of just downstream. So this is an example of the progress of the naval technology in only 100 years. So in 1805, this was the Battle of Trafalgar, which we talked about, where Napoleon's naval forces were defeated. And this is the Battle of, Battle of Tsushima. This is between the Russians and the Japanese. And you see we have steel-hulled ships. They're coal-fired. The weapons are, these are cannons from the broadside. This is gun turrets on the side and on the front. Very, very different. Huge difference in technology. Here's some more. So this is Nelson's ship. This is his flagship, HMS Victory, in the Battle of Trafalgar. This is the Vulture, which is, it's 60 years later. And it's got it's got paddles, right? Then this has got a screw-driven, meaning it's powered from behind. The engine's over here. Okay. This is an armored cruiser. This is a steel ship, or iron hull ship, I should say. Same thing. And then this one, though, has a ram. It's specifically designed to ram wooden ships and sink them. So wooden ships are obsolete by this point. And then this is a Falk-type torpedo boat. It's small, fast, and cheap. You can easily, if you can get a torpedo to hit one of these wooden ships, they're sunk. They're done. So if you're a modern navy and you're going up against an antiquated navy made out of wood, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Okay. And then this is the first British submarine. So this is 1901. And then this is a game changer. This is a dreadnought. It's called the HMS Dreadnought. We call them battleships. It's the same idea, though. This is a gigantic iron ship. The guns can fire miles over the horizon. They are feet thick, so they can withstand torpedo attacks. I mean, at the time, they were seen as the penultimate weapon. So this is the scramble for Africa. So by 1914, there's really 2 places in Africa that are independent by this point. Liberia, which was the only U.S. colony in Africa. Liberia was established as a colony in which the idea was that people who became emancipated, this would have been before the Civil War, that they could have been repatriated to Africa, even if they, by this point, you could have been an African slave in the United States who were multiple generations removed from Africa. So you would have had no connection with Africa other than like through your ancestry. Okay. And then Ethiopia. Remember, Ethiopia too is, it's a Christian country. It's a Christian empire. All right. So pre-imperialist Africa. So there's hundreds of languages, linguistic groups, ethnic groups, independent villages. There were vast empires. We talked about this when we talked about Africa before. It has a long history and traditions that literally go back to the dawning of humanity. There are also extensive trade networks. Africa is trading with Europeans and Asians still. It hasn't been closed off or anything like that. Now, geographically, it was inhibited to Europeans who wanted to expand inward, and we talked about the reason for this, and we said that it was because of malaria. Well, quinine takes that and greatly reduces it. So in 1880, 10% of Africa is in the European in European hands. Most of it is along the coast, okay? Mostly along the northern coast and the southern coast. So Africa is huge. It's roughly the same amount of surface area as the moon. So Portugal, we talked about Portugal before. We talked about the destruction of Lisbon and things like that. But Portugal is an old colonial power, and it has colonies in Africa. Okay, we don't need to go all through all this other stuff. We've already talked about this before, so I don't want to go into it. But I want you to look at this was the extent of the Portuguese Empire at its height. Now Brazil will become independent, but it will still maintain its colonial assets in Africa. It loses them in India, and it'll keep this one over here. It's called Macau, and they'll decline. Okay. Now this pink map, as it's known, this was the idea of what the Portuguese wanted. They wanted to unite their colonies here in the southern half of Africa, and then they would be able to do things like build a railroad connecting it, right? And you can move goods quickly from the Atlantic over to the Indian. Remember, down here, the Cape of Good Hope, this is still a very treacherous place to travel. By this point in history, people know how to do it. It's just that this would reduce the cost, all right? So Portugal wants to do this. The British, though, they don't want that. The British want to be able to link their colony in Egypt down here to Cape Town. So they give what's called the British ultimatum, which says you can't do that. The Portuguese king will actually back down because he doesn't want to go to war with Great Britain. The Portuguese king, he will be assassinated in 1908. And as a result of that, 2 years later, Portugal will stop being a monarchy and will become a republic. Now the Ottomans, very far back into the 16th century, right? Northern Africa, parts of Eastern Africa, these were all parts of the Ottoman Empire. By the time that the 1900 comes around, the Ottoman Empire's nickname is the sick man of Europe. It's lost Greece. It's lost all of its territory in Africa. It's maintained its territory in Arabia, but it's not what it was, okay? So the Ottoman Empire, for lots of reasons, wasn't what it was. It didn't modernize. It failed to keep pace with the industrialized West. All right, Algeria. So French Algeria, there's talk that it's what happened is Charles X was insulted, and to right the wrong that was done to him, he takes over Algeria. It's definitely more complex than that, but so it's known as the Fly Whisk incident, and what it is the day of Algeria, day meaning the leader of Algeria, he struck a French consul at the end of a contentious meeting. A consul meaning it's like a diplomat, so you don't do that. If you do that, it's like striking France itself or any country that has a consul. So Charles X uses this as a pretext for invasion. Louis Napoleon supporters, they don't like the invasion, but it's kind of difficult to withdraw at this point. So between 1830 and 1849, France has control of coastal Algeria, like it's been colonized. But from 1849 to 1962, it's administered as if it was part of France itself. So Algeria, as we know it as an independent country, does not start until 1962. Up until that point, Algeria was seen as literally part of France. It's French Algeria. All right, Egypt. So Egypt used to belong to, it was a part of the Ottoman Empire. This guy is an Albanian Ottoman army officer, so shout out to Miss Kamaj. He travels down to Egypt. He will start a civil war, and he will successfully wrest power away from the Ottomans, and he will establish himself as the leader of a semi-autonomous Egypt in 1805. So there you go. Wahhabi, I'm just going to skip that. All right. Because we don't have time for all the stuff. All right, this is a big deal. So what ends up happening is one of the ways that Europeans are able to accumulate control of foreign places is through debt. It's a foreign debt trap. So in 1875, Egypt begins to default on its loans. So it can no longer obtain loans on European markets. And as a result of this, like specifically what I'm talking about here is the Suez Canal, which was built. The British will use the Egyptians' inability to pay back their loan as justification for stepping in and seizing the country. So yeah, that's really something else. Now it's not as if the Egyptians are like, oh well, come take our country. I mean, there's a war, the British win. Okay, now the British will actually keep Egypt. It'll be a colony of theirs until 1956. So from 1875, when it really begins, until 1956. All right, Sudan. It's right here. The British really want this. They have an idea, which is to unite with their colony down here in South Africa, so they can build a Cairo to Cape Town railroad. I mean, of course, there's like people here, but hey, you know. So these are what are called the Fuzzy Wuzzies, and these are the Sudanese troops that fought against the British. And the first time that the British march into Sudan, they get their butts handed to them. Well, they learn, and then they come back with different tactics. This is what's called fighting in a square. So you can't be surrounded. They have alternating fire, meaning the front row will fire, then they'll move back, reload. The back group rather, will move forward and fire. You also have the Maxim machine gun, so the Fuzzy Wuzzies will be defeated. But the British do have a grudging respect for the Fuzzy Wuzzies, and there's a poem you can read here. I'm not going to read it to you, sorry. Khartoum is their capital, and you can read about this too. But the point is the Sudan will fall, and the British will take it over. Okay, so we have the end of the modest state. So in 1892, Herbert Kitchener is made Sirdar of the Egyptian army. He begins the invasion of Sudan. It's slow, it's deliberate. At the Battle of Omdurman, the Mahdists, they lose 10,000 men. The Anglo-Egyptians, they have 47 killed in action. So the British are able to use their weapons and win. Okay. South Africa, same thing. This used to belong to the Dutch East India Company. The British are going to seize Cape Town. This is actually part of the Napoleonic Wars. The Boers, which are called Afrikaners, they object to the British rule. They're going to do what's called the Great Trek in the 30s, which is they move further into the interior. This is going to lead to fighting by the Boers with the natives, the Zulus. And so this is like the Transvaal, the establishment of the Orange Free State. We don't need to go into too much discussion of this, but this is how the British get it. Okay. Now these are the Zulu. They're led by a man named Shaka. So he has a military innovative, like they're using spears and shields, and they're able to put up a fight, and they are able to hold off the British in the early part of the 19th century. But 1879, there's going to be a border dispute between the Boers, which are the Dutch, and the Zulus. And this leads to the British ultimatum. Shaka Zulu, the king, he refuses to comply with the British demands. And so in 1879, we have the breakout of the Anglo-Zulu War. This right here, I'm not really sure how you say it. Izandlawana. This is the worst British defeat against a technologically inferior indigenous force. Like, it was terrible for them. But that defeat leads to a second massive invasion by the British, and the Zulu kingdom is utterly destroyed. So here is a monument to it. Here they are reenacting it today because, people just love to reenact battles. Then we have the Boer Wars. This is 1880 to 1881. What's interesting about this is Winston Churchill actually will serve here. He's a war correspondent. So, and of course, he's important to both World War I and World War II. It ends up, the Boer War is a victory for the British. It's not a short war, though. I mean, there's the first Boer War, 1880, 1881, then the second from 1899 to 1902. And then South Africa, as we know it, will become right here. It's 1909. It becomes the Union of South Africa. It becomes part of the British Empire. However, the Afrikaners, who are the people of Dutch descent, they'll have some home rule. So these are the Dutch. These are the British. What's interesting too, I mean, if you think about it, because like you guys have had it, like U.S. history, there's photographs, so people can see what happens, the number of dead, and I mean, this is a mass grave. Now, Cecil Rhodes, He's an English-born diamond magnate. He's the founder of De Beers, which is still in existence to this day. They're the reason why diamonds are so expensive. He's the prime minister of the Cape Colony in South Africa. So this is from 1890 to 1896. He's the founder of Rhodesia, which doesn't exist anymore. Now it's Zambia and Zimbabwe. And he is the person who endows the Rhodes Scholarship. So lots of people, lots of famous people will have their starts or part of their education paid for through a Rhodes Scholarship. Quote, most histories of South Africa covering the last decades of the 19th century are contributions to the historiography of Cecil Rhodes. And this is from historian Richard McFarlane. So Rhodes is Colossus. Here he is. He's got his left foot on Cairo. He's got his right foot on Cape Town. So he wants to connect now. And that's what this is supposed to symbolize. All right. So we're going to skip this part. Well, maybe not. This is important. All right. So this is Central Africa and specifically the Congo. So in South Africa, if South Africa is about the exploitation of resources like diamonds and things like that, then Central Africa is about the exploitation of people, from shady dealings with native chieftains to outright slavery. And this is after slavery is supposed to have been outlawed too, by the way, all in the name of national pride. So in 1866, we have a man, his name is David Livingstone. He's exploring Central Africa, and what he's looking for is the source of the Nile. And he leaves, and he hasn't been spotted for 3 years. So in 1869, the New York Herald, it hires Henry Stanley to go and look for Livingstone. So in 1871, Stanley does find Livingstone in a village on the shore of Lake Tanganyika. So he's an American. This is just a depiction of it. It's not actually what it looked like. But he says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, and this is Dr. Livingstone who is there. So the Congo, Stanley returns to Africa in the employ of the King of Belgium. And this is his International African Society, which sounds pleasant enough, but it's definitely not, you guys. In 1882, Belgium will sign treaties with the Congo chiefs that give control of the Congo personally to the King of Belgium, his name is Leopold II. And France is going to assert control of the northern part of the Congo, on the bank of the Congo River. So we have the Congo Free State. This is a place where Africans are brutally exploited on rubber plantations, and it's reported on, and the world will outcry. They will demand that the actions being taken under the name of King Leopold. And so the Belgian government will get involved because they will remove Congo from the control of the king, and they will make it a Belgian colony. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how they were treated. If you didn't meet your quota, if you tried to escape, if you did something that was viewed as wrong, they would literally chop off a hand. And here's a gentleman he's nude, tied, and he's being beaten. Okay, this is Leopold. So it's just a money grab. So the Berlin Conference, it really has far-reaching effects, and it really changes not only Africa, but it's a precursor to the alliances that will form in World War I. So the Berlin Conference is from 1884 to 1885, and this is where Otto von Bismarck tries to reverse course of what I mean by that is by this point, a lot of Africa, what they would call the quote-unquote best lands, were taken or under the control of either the British or the French or some other country, right? So the Germans, they want in. So the conference is going to set the rules for how you can claim African territory. The important thing to understand about the Berlin Conference, which deals with Africa, is no African leaders were invited. None. Okay? Now, Germany will eventually get 4 different locations. They'll get Togo, Cameroon, they call this German Southwest Africa, and then German East Africa. Okay? And they'll lose these in World War I. But so here's the Berlin Conference. That's Otto von Bismarck right here. He's quite old by this point. So this is what I mean when I say that they carved up the continent. So Portugal is going to get Mozambique, which they've had since 1848. And then they'll have Portuguese West Africa. France is going to get Algeria, Tunisia, French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, and then Morocco. Italy is going to get Eritrea. They will try to take over Ethiopia, but they will be defeated in 1895 and they'll fail. They'll take Somaliland and Libya. Britain is going to take South Africa, the Transvaal, which is the northern part of South Africa. They'll take British East Africa. They'll take Egypt, which it will include Sudan and part of Somaliland. Germany will take Togo, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, Germany, East Africa. Spain will hold on to Spanish Sahara, and then they'll take Spanish Morocco in 1913. So this is what's called the Horn of Africa. So the Horn of Africa is not just Somalia. It's Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan. Okay, it's this area right here. And why this is important is, you've got Italian, British, and German, all in this area, and they've made these decisions at the Berlin Conference without consultation of any of these leaders of Africa. Egypt, though, is the rare example because they are going to remain independent, and they do this because of their ability to resist European incursion. It's specifically from the Italians. All right, we talked. Okay, so I want to talk about the pogroms in Russia specifically. So these are violent riots that were directed against a particular group, whether for ethnic or religious purposes. It involved killing, beatings, and public humiliations, destruction of the target group's home and their properties, their businesses, and their religious centers. So the term usually carries connotations of spontaneous hatred within the majority population against a certain, usually an ethnic minority, which they see as dangerous and harming the interests of the majority. So in 19th and 20th century Russia, the people who were targeted were two groups, mostly Jews, but also Catholics, but to a much lesser degree, but mostly Jews. So we're going to skip the Siberia part. We've already talked about some of this before. All right, so this is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Okay, so the Russians they've built this railroad all the way over here to Vladivostok. Their intention was to connect into parts of China. Remember, since I can't even remember when we were talking about this, everybody in Europe is trying to get over to the Spice Islands and also over to China. The Russians, being a land empire, they don't have colonies anywhere else. They try to just do this by building a railroad. Okay, so if you were to take a train and you were to leave and go from Moscow to Vladivostok, it would take you 6 days, 4 hours. You would cross 7 time zones and have traveled 5,772 miles. Russia is massive. All right, so this is Russia and Asia. So Manchuria is a province in China. It's in its northeast part of its territory. So it borders Tibet, Russia, and then Korea. So this area is rich in resources. Japan is not rich in resources, and so they are going to they'll be brought into conflict with the Russians, and they will actually win, and the concession that they get from the Russians will be Manchuria. Even though this is Chinese territory, the Russians will give over their control of this area, and the Japanese will also take Korea as well. All right, Germany. So Germany's desire for a, quote, place in the sun was a key element in the imperial rivalries that helped set the stage for the Great War, meaning World War I, and is an illustrative example of the use of misrepresented treaties to procure land from unlettered local chieftains. So Bismarck does not desire colonies, not at first anyways. Once Germany has formed, he's not in any real desire. He's not in the mood to like go off and gain colonies around the planet. However, he's going to change his mind. Why, we don't really know. So in 1884, that's when he begins calling the various heads of state from, not the heads of state, but the foreign ministers from the different countries to what's called the Berlin Conference. It's called that because it was held in Berlin. So he wants Germany to gain access, okay, to Africa and other places. Germany has begun her colonial enterprise very late and was therefore at a disadvantage of finding all of the desirable places already occupied. So this is Kaiser Wilhelm giving an interview with Cecil Rhodes. Remember, Cecil Rhodes is the guy, the Rhodes Colossus. This is the guy who, De Beers the diamond. So this is not the Kaiser who was crowned in Versailles. This is that guy's son. This is Wilhelm II. So the German Colonization Society, it's a civilian organization. They spread all kinds of propaganda, and then they wanted a naval project. The Germans realized that if they were going to have foreign colonies, they needed what the British had, which is they needed a navy. There wasn't a lot of unclaimed land that was left, though, so they took what they could, which was at the equatorial, the southwest and southeast African coast. They also got Pacific Islands. Many of these were actually purchased from the Spanish. The Spanish were in decline, great decline by this point. And they have a dream of a high seas fleet. The Kaiser is actually a cousin to the guy who will be king of England. And so he wants what he has, which is a navy. So this is going to be the German Empire around the outbreak of World War I. So this is Germany itself, and then these are the 4 locations in Africa, and then these are its lands and islands that it has. Now some of these at the end and then its locations inside of China as well. Okay. And that's it. Thank you.